Japan attacks the United States. So while most of our lessons have been focused on the military campaigns going on throughout Europe, there was also a Pacific campaign, or a Pacific theater. It's called different things by different textbooks, but we're going to shift gears and head to the Pacific theater, because as things were getting settled in Europe, there continues to be fighting picking up, actually, in the Pacific theater. So like Hitler, Japan's military leaders also had dreams of an empire. In fact, there are a lot of similarities between the Japanese perspectives and attitudes and Nazi Germany's. For example, the Japanese believed themselves to be a superior racially to the people around them, and they were also looking for living space. So like Hitler, Japan's military leaders also had dreams of an empire. Japan's expansion had begun in 1931. That year, Japanese troops took over Manchuria in northeastern China. There were a couple of reasons for that, one being resources, but another being living space. And I will back up and show you some contextual video that'll last about 6 minutes in just a little bit. 6 years later, Japanese armies swept into the heartland of China. They expected a really quick victory. Chinese resistance, however, caused the war to drag on. This placed a strain on the Japanese economy. To increase their resources, Japanese leaders looked toward the rich European colonies of Southeast Asia. By October of 1940, Americans had cracked one of the codes that the Japanese used in sending secret messages. Therefore, they were well aware of Japanese plans for Southeast Asia. If Japan conquered European colonies there, it could also threaten the American-controlled Philippine Islands and Guam. To stop the Japanese advance, the United States government sent aid to strengthen Chinese resistance, which is going to include people like Chiang Kai-shek, who you'll meet in just a minute, and other Chinese nationalists. When the Japanese overran French Indochina, which would include Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in July of 1941, Roosevelt then cut off oil shipments to Japan, leaving them desperate. Okay, I'm going to show you a video now that just sets some context for China at this point, Japan's aggression in China, and also a little bit, we'll end with the rape of Nanking.
The century can be characterized as one of factionalism, lawlessness, foreign intervention by Western powers, and rising nationalist sentiments, which in 1911 culminated in the overthrow of the established Qing dynasty by the Nationalist Republicans, or Kuomintang. This led to intense regionalism across China as warlords took control of small territories that they ruled in their own name. By the 1920s, the spread of communism led to the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, which was suppressed by the Kuomintang, the leader of which was the cunning Chiang Kai-shek, who subjugated influential warlords in order to secure his rule over China. Soon after, Chiang turned his attention towards the communists, igniting the Chinese Civil War in 1927. Japan, by contrast, had been relatively isolated for millennia. The island nation had developed a highly militaristic society, and this was intensified after the Emperor of Japan consolidated his power in what was known as the Meiji Restoration, with its population's adherence to warrior and feudal codes translating into a religious devotion to the emperor. These years of seclusion contributed to the development of a xenophobic mentality. The Japanese viewed their culture as the most sophisticated and civilized. This sense of national pride continued to inflate despite increased influence of the West in matters of technology and trade throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The combination of ultranationalism, a centralized state, and European technology allowed Japan, in the First Sino-Japanese War, to conquer Korea from the Chinese, whose administrative process and technology paled in comparison. The Japanese would continue to expand throughout the Pacific and onto the East Asian mainland. The requirements of both a large population and a large military began to strain the Japanese economy, causing ever deeper expansion into the Asian mainland. In September of 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, which offered ample resources and living space. As justification, Japan cited the Mukden incident, in which elements of the Imperial Japanese Army detonated a small amount of dynamite at a section of the South Manchuria Railway, which had been granted to them in the Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese then falsely accused China of sabotage. Despite receiving orders to keep the incident contained at a local level, the Japanese army proceeded to capture all of the cities along the South Manchuria Railway, and surprisingly, the Republic of China maintained a policy of non-resistance, although some Chinese warlords and generals tried to resist, but unsuccessfully. By February of 1932, Japan had control over all of Manchuria, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, which, interestingly, was governed by the last emperor of China, the 26-year-old Po Yi. The Chinese appealed to the League of Nations in response, and after a year-long investigation, the League concluded that the invasion was unjustified, to which Japan simply left the League of Nations. Chiang Kai-shek was aware that the Japanese interests in China were not over, and so in 1936 he agreed to an alliance with the Communists, putting the Chinese Civil War on hold. Less than 1 year later, the Second Sino-Japanese War would break out in full, when, on the 7th of July, Japanese troops conducted a military exercise near the Marco Polo Bridge in Wanping, which startled the Chinese garrison, who weren't warned in advance. In the resulting confusion, shots were exchanged, and after the skirmish ended, the Japanese noticed one of their men was missing after a head count. When the Chinese refused to allow them to search the city, the Japanese attacked the city head-on, trying to cross the bridge. On July 20th, Japan began bombarding Wanping, and by the end of the month had taken Beijing and the surrounding areas. The Japanese were initially content with the territory they'd taken in northern China and wanted to end the war quickly, but Chiang Kai-shek was not giving up anytime soon. He decided to open up a second front at the city of Shanghai, storming the Japanese quarter of the city on the 13th of August. The fighting around the Shanghai area lasted for a total of 3 months, marked by intense close-quarters combat. Shanghai finally fell when an amphibious Japanese force landed in the southern region of the city, which was left undefended. The Chinese took heavy casualties, losing 250,000 men, many of them their highest quality troops, while the Japanese lost 60,000. On the 8th of November, Chiang ordered his forces to retreat west, towards the city of Nanking, the capital of China at the time. The Chinese in Nanking were positioned in elaborate fortifications inside and outside of the city. Despite these defenses, the Japanese had captured the southern portion of the city by December 12th, which prompted Chiang to evacuate his troops from the city. The Japanese were frustrated after what they thought would be an easy victory. This frustration translated into brutality against the civilians, who were raped and executed on an immense scale. Estimates for the number of casualties ranges from 50,000 to 300,000. The massacre is possibly the defining event in the Second Sino-Japanese War, and is possibly one of the single largest atrocities in human history. As such, the event remains one of the primary reasons why, even today, relations between Japan and China are at best somewhat bitter.
So while all of that's going on in China, in part to capture resources in Manchuria, while all of that's going on, Japan decides also to open up a front against the United States in hopes of gaining access to oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Despite an oil shortage, the Japanese continued their conquest. They hoped to catch European colonial powers in the United States by surprise, so they planned massive attacks on the British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia and on American outposts in the Pacific at the same time. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's greatest naval strategist, also called for an attack on the U.S. fleet in Hawaii. It was, he said, a dagger pointed at Japan's throat and must be destroyed. So, early in the morning of December 7th, 1941, American sailors at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii awoke to the roar of explosives. A Japanese attack was underway. U.S. military leaders had known from a coded Japanese message that an attack might come, but they weren't sure when or where it would occur. Within 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 19 ships, including 8 battleships moored in Pearl Harbor. More than 2,300 Americans were killed, with over 1,100 wounded, and news of the attack stunned the American people. The very next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress. December 7th of 1941, he declared, "It was a date which will live in infamy." Congress quickly accepted his request for a declaration of war on Japan and its allies. Almost at the same time of the Pearl Harbor attack, the Japanese launched bombing raids on the British colony of Hong Kong and American-controlled Guam and Wake Island, and they also landed an invasion force in Thailand. The Japanese drive for the Pacific Empire was now underway. The United States has been undergoing something called the Manhattan Project, which was done highly secretively in the United States. It was led by a guy named Robert Oppenheimer, and you guys were supposed to read about the Manhattan Project, so we're going to end this with a quiz over that. The Manhattan Project had spots throughout the United States that were putting pieces of the Manhattan Project together. Some right in Hanford in Washington state, but you can see throughout the United States that there were a number of different places working on things similar to this or something in tandem with this. Los Alamos, New Mexico was one of the best known facilities today, along with Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We're going to end with a clip of Pearl Harbor.